Super Bowl. We'll get through them on Sunday. So what you have as a set of tools now is really the basis for price, what we would normally call price theory. You can now look at demand and supply curves, assume there's a market out there, get to an equilibrium price, make some observation that some part of the market's changed, and look and see what happens to consumer surplus and producer surplus and quantity of demand and quantity of supply, and make some predictions of what might happen in the marketplace. And in another 2 weeks, we will start doing, or 10 days, we'll start doing what is best described as theory of the firm. So we'll start looking at firm structure, why some firms look more competitive than others, why some firms are able to set their own prices and others are not able to set their own prices. But what we're going to do for at least the next 2 or 3 or 4 classes is go through applications in price theory really from a regulatory standpoint. So we're going to look at what happens when some agent, typically the government, but it could be the people through an initiative or some other process, impose some sort of restriction on the market. And we want to see when you put those restrictions on the market, what sort of things actually occur. I should introduce these. So if you want to know if economists can get undergraduate degrees and actually go to work, the 3 people in the back work for me. And things are slow, so they decided they'd suffer through one of my lectures. But if you want to talk to people who graduated recently with econ degrees, they're a good bunch to do it with. So we're going to start with, I'm just going to run through which ones we're going to do. We're going to do price controls. And when we say price controls, we mean either price ceilings, price floors. Price ceilings are things like rent controls, wage and price controls, which occurred in the United States in the early 70s and also during World War II. And actually right now they're occurring in a large way in Venezuela. They have all sorts of wage and price controls in place. And at some point, today we're going to focus on the theoretical stuff, and we'll probably push that into Monday as well. But then we're going to look at some of the real versions of this, where we'll look at New York City, from California, and a potential Seattle rent control situation. And see what the implications are for that. We're also going to look at price floors. So price floors are typically agriculture. So we're actually going to look at the U.S. sugar program, and we'll look at this in detail. We're also going to look at minimum wage laws and the effect the Seattle minimum wage has. So you have a sugar program, you have corn, wheat, what else did I say? Minimum wage. So those are the price control entities. And then we're going to look at price discrimination. So when I say price discrimination, I'm not talking about discrimination in hiring somebody or something like, I'm not talking about race discrimination or gender discrimination in hiring. I'm talking about firms being able to distinguish between and among potential buyers and charge them different prices. So medical services is sort of the classic one in the United States, the one you're very familiar with in travel are airlines. Airlines are fascinating because they do it on the fly. The data, there's so much data out there right now that they're able to, as we'll see, do different sorts of price discrimination on the fly. And university tuitions, which we'll go into in more detail from a price discrimination standpoint, and look at how colleges price discriminate. And then lastly, if we do it in this order, we're going to look at import quotas. But we're going to look at that in terms of what happens when you open up a market, and then what are the implications of imposing quotas. So the ones that come to mind immediately are steel quotas. So we're always accusing the Asian countries of shipping us steel that's somehow subsidized so we can impose quotas on it. It's most of the time we lose those arguments. There's steel, textiles have always been a big one. Sugar, as it turns out, is both a price control and an import quota issue. Those are the main ones. You'll find in Canvas, not all there yet, but they will be all there in the next few days, a host of readings by subject area. And when I say readings, these are not 25-page diatribes. Mostly they're 1 or 2 page newspaper or observation articles that go through one of these subjects in a little more detail. You should also be reading pages or chapters 6 and 8 and 9 if you haven't read them yet. You've been through them, and also pages 314 to about 319, which is on price discrimination. We're sort of jumping ahead on price discrimination. People normally stick it in an analysis of monopoly, but I think it's more a pricing issue. So do keep up with those readings, because you're just going to start getting a flavor for this as we do the analysis. We'll do all the theoretical stuff first, and then we'll repeat it as we go through the different subject areas. I think I said at the beginning of the quarter, there's stuff that I wanted you to take with you when you left. This is the sort of stuff I want you to be able to be sitting at the dining room table or at the bar, arguing with somebody and looking at your pad and going, I know this better than you do. So hopefully you're going to know it better than you do. And some of these topics are current. I mean, the minimum wage piece in Seattle, and I suspect before long a rent control issue in Seattle will become current topics. And the minimum wage one's going to be debated for years here. So we're going to start with, let's start with price floors. I guess the other thing I should say here as we do this, unless you're from North Dakota or someplace like that, as you're analyzing this stuff, you're going to be saying to yourself, this looks awfully conservative. You know, this is not a liberal Seattle sort of view of the world. This is an agnostic view of the world. We're not taking a political position on this. We're trying to use economic tools to analyze a particular situation. Most of the policies that we look at, so when we look at minimum wage or we look at rent controls, we're going to look at them and go, these are policies that are designed to help people. They have some value. in that, but they may not be carefully analyzed and they may have repercussions that are bad. So that's what we're looking at. So when you do this sort of analysis, all the time you're thinking of what's the purpose of this policy? Why do they put in this minimum wage law? Why do they have price floors on agricultural products? And then if you're going to go ahead and say this is a bad idea, you should start trying to figure out, are there alternatives for solving those problems if there are real problems out there? If wages are too low, or you're not getting enough food, or farmers are closing down, whatever the case may be, are there policies that you can put in place that help solve those problems? So you're going to want to look at that side of it as well. So, so there's our normal market equilibrium. And let's suppose that we have a situation that says, okay, we have that market equilibrium, but now we're going to impose a price floor. We're going to go ahead and say, somehow the government is going to go ahead and say, price is not going to fall below PF. As it turns out, the sugar program is a great example of this in the United States. We used to have a honey program. The honey program is the only one that's ever been totally done away with. We have price supports. These are called price supports. We have price supports for wheat. We have price supports for corn. As it turns out, and it's notable, I'll do this first. When you impose a price floor and it's binding, in other words, when I say it's binding, I mean PF is greater than PE. That implies you have a surplus. And in this particular case, at a price PF, this is going to be the quantity demanded. This is going to be the quantity supplied. Look up. You see those two? And QS minus QD is equal to your surplus. It's this here. The reason I throw the piece in about it being binding or not, if PF is less than PE, which has happened with corn the last dozen years because the price of corn has been propped up by another program, which is the ethanol program. So everybody's growing corn. If you drove across the Midwest, when was this? About 6 or 7 years ago, when they first put in a program that said cars had to use 10%, gasoline had to have 10% ethanol in it in the wintertime. So where does ethanol come from? Ethanol comes from corn. You drive across the Midwest, and there's not a square inch of the Midwest that didn't have a corn plant coming out of it. Everybody and their brother planted corn. They got rid of all the fence rows. You know, people had corn grown in their driveways. I mean, it's just everywhere. That's still to some extent the case. I mean, we were growing corn for ethanol in Western Washington. Western Washington is a terrible place to grow corn, but the price was enough to do that. But if the price of the floor is less than the equilibrium price, it has no effect. So in the case of corn, during those years, there was no expenditure on price floor. So how does the price floor get maintained? Well, it has to occur through some sort of government purchases. So typically what happens when you have a pure price support is you will have the government buying up stuff. So we still have them, but we used to have much larger dairy supports. So the government would buy milk. So if you didn't have, in this country, Yeah, we do all sorts of things in weird ways. So we put in milk price support, so dairy farmers would go ahead and get more money for their milk. And then we financed all this terrific research. Most of it, incidentally, coming out of Poland, so the Go Foods commercial was correct, where we went from a cow producing, in about a 15-year period, we went from cows producing 15 to 20 pounds of milk a day to cows producing over 100 pounds of milk a day by changing their diets and genetically changing them and feeding them drugs and all sorts of other things. So you ended up with these huge surpluses of milk, which the government typically bought up. For a while they gave it to daycare centers. So you got daycare centers love it because it's cheap cheese. But a lot of it just got poured out. It didn't have anything to do with it. If you drove across eastern Washington in the mid-80s, you would see piles of wheat. And when I say piles of wheat, I mean the size of this campus and 200 feet high, just of wheat. And you want to see the greatest places in the world to hunt pheasants, because you just walk around these big piles of wheat and you get all these fat pheasants that were running around. It was all surplus stuff that was bought by the government. And it's just basically rotted there. In Europe, they used to describe lakes of milk and mountains of cheese because they had the same sort of price supports. All these require government purchases of one sort or another. And again, we've done it with honey, dairy products, a lot of agricultural goods. And you say to yourself, well, first of all, you look at that and go, well, that's not necessarily good. Who loses? Well, producers certainly gain, because there's their new revenue pile. This used to be revenue, right? That used to be their revenue. You put in price support, and all of a sudden, producer revenue goes sky high. Okay, that's why producers love it. Consumers obviously lose. This used to be producer surplus. Now this is producer surplus. So you're spending more on cheese, you're spending more on milk. In the sugar situation, they estimate it costs Americans something like $10 a piece a year to have the sugar supports we now have in place. Very expensive. It costs jobs in particular industries. So if you ever wonder why, here's a test. This is a great test. You'll love this. So go to the grocery store, buy a bar of Hershey's chocolate, made in Hershey, Pennsylvania, and go buy some little packet of Swiss chocolate that costs like $6 for a chunk this big, and do a taste test. And you'll go, oh, this Swiss chocolate's a whole different product. Because they spend more money on expensive chocolate and expensive milk and all that stuff. The American producers are spending 3 and 4 and 5 times as much on sugar than the European producers are doing it. So there's a total mix in the recipe. So we produce lousy chocolate because of that. And it's true of lots and lots of stuff. One of the reasons we use corn syrup, which is fructose, corn sugar in so many items is because it's way cheaper than cane sugar. It's not controlled. So American foods have a different mix of stuff, and these things cause all sorts of odd distortions in the marketplace. That's a neat one. But I guess before I do the other piece, producers obviously gain from this. They like it. So these guys that own these incredibly large sugarcane fields all over the Everglades, most of the sugar production is Texas and Florida. And the Everglades is, I would say, totally destroyed just because of this. But a large portion of the Everglades has been sorely impacted by sugar production. Those guys create really strong lobbies because you're taking billions of dollars away from 300 million consumers and you're giving it to 10 or 15 or 20,000 sugar producers. So they have a huge interest in keeping these price supports in place, and they lobby for it. So there's real strength in the lobbying pieces here. Now, having said all that, you go, well, why the heck did we do this? Well, we do it because these things came into play in the 30s. And they came into play because we had the Dust Bowl, and we actually had situations where first we had all sorts of crop flourishing. We had these huge supplies of certain crops. You had price crashes, but then you also had the Dust Bowl. And if this is time, we'll just call that tons of food on that axis. And this is still true in a lot of countries. This is true in a lot of Africa, that let's say this level of food production means everybody's healthy. That's how much food production you actually need, okay? And farmers produce that because there's a market for that, and that's how it works. But let's suppose for a number of reasons food production looks like this. So and that's how it looks like in Africa. Actually, that's how it looks like in the United States. Less so. I'll come back to that in a second. But let's suppose you just have those ups and downs. Well, you certainly have these years where you have great crops and everybody has lots of food and you get to add 10 pounds to your waist and all sorts of stuff like that. Okay. But then you have these other years where people don't have enough food, you have starvation. And again, this is still happening in Africa. What do? Well, as a government, you try to encourage some sort of modification of this up and down, or you move the up and down up here. Or actually, if you're perfect at it, you move it like that. You figure out a way to get farmers to produce enough food every year that you never have starvation. That's the purpose of food subsidies. And I say starvation, but I'm also including the idea of shortages of certain sorts of foods. These things were put in place to get rid of the problem of having any sort of food shortages. And that's why they continue to exist. We don't want this particular situation. Now, what's happened since the 30s is what in terms of agricultural production? We've had what is known as the Green Revolution, where, and that's actually the name of it, I can't remember the guy's name. He passed away last year. He's the guy that figured out fertilizers and that you could incredibly increase production of agricultural foodstuffs through fertilizers. And we really changed the world landscape of how much food we produce. So what's occurred now, and this is also what I described in the dairy case, where you went from 15 pounds or 20 pounds of milk to 100 pounds of milk, poor cows. So now, where we used to have this is what we were aiming for in the 30s. The technological changes have put it way up here. So the United States is producing all this food, most of it, not most of it, a huge amount of it gets shipped overseas. We don't necessarily need as much subsidy. Maybe we don't need any subsidy as we used to use, because this represents technological change in the production. And keep in mind, these farmers have an incentive to produce more. These dairy farmers all of a sudden are being told, well, you're not going to get $1 a gallon, you're going to get $3 a gallon. And what do they say? I'm going to produce more. So they figure out ways to produce more. Not only do they just buy more cows, they start giving those cows hormones that make them produce more milk. So what we did, at least in the dairy industry, in the Must have been the 70s and the 80s. We went out as a government, the United States government went out and started buying dairy farms. And if you travel, doesn't matter where you travel in the United States, you'll see these big barns and these big, look like they used to be dairy facilities that no longer have dairy cows in them. And they went out and they bought these dairy farms. They offered farmers money for the dairy farms because we decided it was cheaper to buy them out. And the caveat is they can't be used as a dairy farm anymore. So we restricted production that way. But what happened was people just went next door and bought more land and put in a new facility that was more productive than the last facility. And now we're back where we started from. So now we have this big surplus of milk land. So it's hard to beat the system. What else? So in general, when we talk about these price floors, consumers are going to lose, producers are going to gain, and you're going to have surpluses. So we can take this, and we will take it, and extend it and say, okay, here is the demand for labor, and here is the supply of labor, and let's say this is low cost, low wage labor. So we're looking at dishwashers and waiters and waitresses and stuff like that. And you'd have an equilibrium wage. There's the equilibrium wage rate. And then you go ahead and impose a minimum wage on the system. And if you have a minimum wage that's below this wage rate, it has no impact at all. So imagine, again, I keep coming back to North Dakota. North Dakota just turns out to be a good example. Melanie's from North Dakota, so I get to pick on her too. North Dakota for 5 years had the last 5 years had a $7.25 minimum wage. How many people in North Dakota do you think were working for $7.25? Zero. If you wanted to flip hamburgers for 16 bucks, you went to North Dakota. It was a non-binding federal minimum wage. So, depending on what this market's like, minimum wages may be non-binding. But, as we're going to see in Seattle's case, there's a possibility that the wage, a $15 wage could be up here, which means you're going to have a surplus of labor, you're going to have higher unemployment, you have all sorts of odd things going on in the marketplace. And we'll go through that in a lot more detail, but this analysis applies to labor markets and minimum wages. And what we'll see is that the minimum wage scenarios are entirely different in Washington State than they might be in North Dakota or Louisiana or Tennessee because they have different prevailing wage rates. And that's really what we have to look at. We have to look at who gains and who loses in those situations. The thing to keep in mind here, and you have to close your eyes and change your perspective to do it, the demanders of labor in a labor market are firms. The suppliers of labor are laborers. So you need to switch what your mentality may be trying to drive you to. Anybody have any questions at this point? Your readings on this are going to be mostly agricultural and minimum wage related. So you'll see a lot of stuff. We'll go through the sugar program in gory detail because it also applies to the import quota piece, but we'll do minimum wages as well. Any questions at this point on this one? Okay. So now we are going to go ahead and do going to do price ceilings. And probably the classic price ceiling analysis that you can look at is rent controls. And about 20 years ago, when you guys were still wandering around in diapers, there actually was an ordinance in Seattle to impose a rent control in Seattle. And I can't remember if this was done by initiative or it was done in the legislature, but there's now a law in the state of Washington that says you can't have rent controls. And if we see rent controls come back on the plate in the state of Washington, it's going to be aimed at overturning that particular law for starters. And of course, the concern these days is that a two-bedroom, well, a one-bedroom apartment on Broadway now costs $1,900. So the cost of apartments is going up, and there are reasons for that. And the question is, are there ways to provide housing to lots of people in other ways besides rent controls? But this is a classical price ceiling. There's the quantity of units over a period of time. There's dollars or rent in dollars. Demand for housing and supply for housing. So look up a second. So we know we have an equilibrium rental rate of housing. There it is right there. There's QE and there's P. That's our equilibrium rate. If we impose a price ceiling above equilibrium, okay, if we have PC greater than PE, there's no effect. That would be up here somewhere. This has no effect on the marketplace. It's non-binding. Everybody ignores it. If the price ceiling is less than equilibrium, then you have a shortage, where QD is greater than QS. So let's put our price ceiling. There's the quantity demanded, there's the quantity supplied. QD minus QS is equal to a shortage. So now you should be asking yourself, as you should in all these questions, who gains and who loses from this? Well, you certainly have, this is how many of these things are going to be supplied in the marketplace. That's how many are going to be supplied. Firms are just not going to supply them unless you get a higher price. This is the price they're going to be able to sell it for. At least the superficial price they're going to be able to sell it for, PC. Does everybody see that? But in the marketplace, you've got all these people out there, and how much are they willing to pay for those housing units? They're willing to pay this much. Call it P1. In other words, the rent control may say this apartment goes for $1,000, and somebody's out there that's willing to pay $1,500, but you're not allowed to rent it to them. So you end up essentially with the shortage, and you end up with this thing. Well, before I get there. So the question then becomes, you have a shortage. This could be gasoline. So we saw this in the early 70s under the first oil market. The question becomes, how do you allocate QS, you no longer have a market system that's allocating the goods and services. You're going to have some other system. You're going to have some extra market phenomenon. Because what is that stuff? What is that stuff? That's total revenue to the landlords, right? That's just the price control times the quantity they're selling. This, we know, is what these consumers value the goods at, on average, over what they're having to pay for it. Actually, it's all of this. So in a sense, you could say it's potential consumer surplus. Another way of saying is, which you never would have come up with, non-exclusive income. That's some sort of surplus from trade, and we don't know how it's going to be distributed. So how do you end up distributing goods that are under some sort of price ceiling? So does anybody know what happened when there were gasoline restrictions in the 1970s? Do you know how we distributed gasoline? Lines. We allocated stuff. It was rationing by weighting. Every gas station all over the country had big, long lines until they ran out of what they considered their quota for the day, and then they just shut down. And people would get in line sometimes for a day in advance to get their gasoline tank filled up. So the way they allocated these goods and dissipated, in other words, if you're waiting for these in line, these gains from trade that could be consumer surplus just get wasted and they're not productive, so they get dissipated. So you actually have a waste in the system. You have a dead weight loss, which is the same as you have in the tax situation. But this actually gets lost in terms of other trade unless you can figure out other ways to gain by it. So if your dad owns a gas station or your cousin owns a gas station, you can go to the front of the line or you can fill up with gas early or whatever the case may be. You gain by this particular system. If you can somehow get around the normal restriction, this looks good to you. But if you can't, you're going to waste stuff. So what we saw happening is not only did we see people figure out ways that they would get around waiting in line, so they would hire people to get in line at low cost of putting somebody in a car and saying, here, get this filled up today. But all of a sudden you would see oil change $50 with fill-up. So people would sign up for oil changes. And their cars would get filled up with their oil, so people were getting their oil changed once and twice a week. So if you figure out and who's getting the gain from that? The producer, the guy that owned the gas station. Okay, in the case of your dad owns the gas station, you're getting the benefit of this, except your dad's not giving you an allowance anymore because he's losing money on his gas. But you're paying lower prices for gas. So this fuzzy part that used to be gains from trade, part of it used to be producer surplus, part of it used to be consumer surplus, gets lost in these extra transactions. This happens whenever you put these price ceilings in place. So you see it, what we're going to see too, when we look at New York City and Santa Barbara rent controls, is there's this huge demand for these very cheap apartments. And landlords come up with ways of, all of a sudden, apartments have these signs on them that say furnished apartment. Of course, there's a 40-year-old couch that 5 cats have peed on, that's the furnishings. But you're paying an extra $500 a month for that couch. And that's how the landlord's doing it. Or in New York, they had a very clever device called key money. So you pay your $800 a month for this gorgeous apartment on Park Avenue, but it costs you $10,000 to get the key. So the landlord's, again, collecting. And of course, over time, if you're the regulatory agency that's pushing these things, you have to figure out ways to control these sort of extra market phenomenon, and they do. But the other thing that happens is that firms lose incentives to invest in these particular productive activities. So you end up with fewer gas stations, for one, and less production of gasoline in general. What do you end up in the rental world? Well, you end up with individuals unwilling to provide rental housing. So instead of making it so we have lots of rental housing for low-income people, we start to see landlords get out of the rental business. They sell their businesses off, or what else do they do? What do you think happens to the maintenance of rental properties? Does the landlord have the same incentive he had before to maintain the place? He doesn't. So we see, not only in New York City, but in just about every place, that landlords first they lower their maintenance standards. In New York City, we actually saw them stop maintaining businesses. They don't want to pay taxes. They abandon buildings, which we've seen in a number of countries. In Hong Kong, they had a rent control. Where one of the stipulations was that the rent control only applied to buildings, I think it was 1968, built prior to 1968. So, and this is 1972 that this thing's in place. So you had these guys that built a building in 1966 that's a perfectly good building. Demand for housing got such that they just tore the building down and built a new one because they had no restriction on the building at the time. So that's how extreme it would get. But if you look at it, it's less so now. You can still drive through neighborhoods in New York City that look like parts of Dresden after the bombings in World War II, literally. I mean, buildings just knocked down and totally dilapidated and boarded up and all that, totally unmaintained. And they're all rent controlled. And the landlords have basically abandoned them. We'll look at the New York City situation in a detailed way. It's hard to get around these things. Every time you write a rent control ordinance, you have to write a rent control ordinance that includes all sorts of stipulations. No key money, no money extra for furnishings. You have to go through all these details because they're all extra market ways to get around these particular problems. In some scenarios, maybe in terms of rents, it's not so, because I can come up with a half dozen other ways to solve this problem. But if you're looking at gas rationing, when we had gas rationing in the 70s, they had all of these, I mean, the lines were ridiculous. I mean, you're literally lines that were 3 and 4 hours at a pop to fill up a gas tank. And then they made the announcement that there were no more price controls on gasoline. It ended on June 8th or something. The lines completely disappeared on June 9th. And what do you think happened to prices? They just went up to get what they had been in the old equilibrium. But lines disappeared. And there's no really good way of doing anything else. I mean, what you see historically in the cases where you have these price ceilings. So in World War II, there were lots of price ceilings. Goods and services in the United States were just rationed and the prices were controlled. So what developed both in the United States and England because of these things? Come on, some of you watch Masterpiece Theater. Nobody does. All these black markets. So the next thing that happens is you develop black markets to deal with the price controls. So the same thing we're describing here with goods and services. So we're dealing with either rental properties or we're dealing with gasoline. The same thing occurs with currency controls. So you'll see governments all the time putting an official exchange rate on currency. And it's basically a price control. And if you go to certain countries, stuff your pockets full of dollars because you can get 5 times as many rubles on the streets than you can in a bank in Russia now. And the same is true in lots and lots of countries. And one of the ways they got around this at certain periods of time is they used to tie currencies to the dollar. So Panama used to tie its currency to the dollar, and it actually switched to the dollar for a while. But these price controls apply to currencies as well. And you do see the black markets develop in all of this as soon as you stick some sort of control in the system. And essentially what we see in rental housing markets is some sort of black market developing for these things. Questions on this one? Okay, we're going to do one more of these that's a little more convoluted, and you've seen a piece of it before. But we'll do the first part of it, and then let you go on some people. Is anybody going to theaters? I was at the Washington Athletic Club this morning. You know what tickets are going for? $14,000. Someone takes it. So I know 3 guys that have plane tickets, and they just don't know whether to go. Even if it gets cut by a quarter, it's too much, right? But the prices are astronomical. And the interesting thing about that. Actually, this is price control. This is great. We get to talk about football. So everybody's mad at the NFL because the NFL is the one that sets the prices for the Super Bowl. And they're going, wow, Seattle season ticket holders can't get tickets for starting ticket price was $800. That was the lowest ticket price you could get. And they went it up. So what's the other argument? What did I just tell you tickets were selling for? $14,000. What is the NFL trying to do by charging these really high prices? They're trying to collect some of the consumer surplus. In other words, there are people out there willing to pay whatever the price is, $3,000 for that $800 ticket. The NFL is, and this is true of all scalping tickets, but the NFL is basically saying, look, if we just give you all these tickets for $100 a piece, you're just going to go out there and create a secondary black market. That's what the scalping market is. That's what StubHub is. And you're going to get the benefits of this. And the consumers are still going to pay high prices. So what the NFL is simply saying is, we want to get the benefits of this. We're going to go ahead and collect this extra consumer surplus that's going on. That's why they're charging high prices to begin with, which turn out not to be high enough. But again, to those of you that go to football games at the last minute, you can probably go down there, and I bet you there are tickets under $500 5 minutes after the game starts. There's going to be. So the best thing to do, I do this with theater in New York. You go 10 minutes before the theater opens, and you go by yourself. So you only need 1 ticket, and you get in it really cheap, or somebody gives you a ticket. They go, here, take the ticket. But that gets around the black market issues that are always developing. So you guys should look. So here's your assignment for Sunday while you're partying and watching the game, keep your iPad on and put it on StubHub and see what happens to prices and see if there are any other markets going on down there. And we'll see what happens to prices as we get closer to game time. Does anybody know, have they dropped yet? Has anybody looked at all?
I looked this morning, the top price right now for silent tickets, $18,000
Yeah.
on StubHub, so.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible. I was looking for theater tickets in New York, and I was seeing tickets that were 4 and 5 times the rates. And again, my brother's telling me, just go 10 minutes before, and I'm going, I don't want to go to New York and not get the tickets, sort of stuff. But they're selling them. I mean, I think these guys that I was talking to in the WAC this morning, I think if it gets under $10,000, they'll go. Sort of like, and I must say, if it were the 5th or 6th game of the World Series, I'd probably go. So it depends on your sport, I guess. But it'll be interesting to watch. Do watch. Pull out your iPads, your computers, and see if you can figure out what tickets are and watch it for a while. It'll be interesting to watch. Okay. Go ahead. This takes 45 minutes. Go watch it. Go watch this. So what we're going to do, make sure you read Chapter 9 for Monday. Chapter 9 is international trade. Go Hawks.